I never thought one thunderstorm would completely change the way I looked at Antonio. If you'd asked me that morning what my weekend was going to be like, I would have told you it was going to be painfully boring. My parents were out of town for an anniversary trip. My older brother Mike had invited a couple of friends over to watch the basketball playoffs, and I planned on spending the whole evening upstairs pretending I wasn't avoiding the mountain of work waiting on my laptop. Then the weather decided to ruin everyone's plans. The rain started just after dinner. Not the normal kind either. It came down so hard that the windows actually rattled. Thunder rolled every few minutes. Lightning lit up the backyard like it was daytime, and before long, the local news was warning everyone not to drive unless it was an emergency. That was when Mike walked into the kitchen with Antonio. "You've got to be kidding me," Mike muttered while staring out the window. Antonio laughed. "I told you we should have left earlier. You told me after we'd already started another game. Still counts." Even hearing his voice made me glance up from my phone. Antonio had been Mike's friend since high school. He was 24, a year older than my brother, and somehow he'd been around our house for so many years that my mum practically treated him like another son. He'd show up unannounced, raid the refrigerator, tease my dad about his grilling skills, and somehow leave everyone smiling. Everybody liked Antonio, including me, probably more than I should have. Not that I'd ever let anyone know. He was one of those guys who never seemed to be trying, but everything came naturally anyway. Easy smile, calm confidence, the type of person who remembered small details about people, asked how your week was going, and actually listened to the answer. Whenever he came over, he'd always stop to talk to me instead of pretending I wasn't there. "How's college going, Cameron? How's, you still making those digital drawings? You ever finish that game you were obsessed with?" Little things, probably meaningless, except they never felt meaningless to me. Mike sighed dramatically. "Well, you're not driving home in this." Antonio looked back toward the front window where sheets of rain were blowing sideways. "I've driven through worse." Right on cue, another crack of thunder shook the house. Even Antonio winced. Mike folded his arms. "Yeah, you're staying." Antonio rubbed the back of his neck. "You sure your parents won't mind? They'll probably be happier knowing you didn't wrap your truck around a tree." I stayed quiet while pretending to scroll through my phone. Inside, though, my heart had already started doing something stupid. Antonio was staying overnight at our house. That had happened before, over the years, usually after parties or late-night football games. But I was younger then. Now everything felt different, not because of him, because of me. I'd spent the last year trying very hard not to notice how attractive he'd become. It wasn't working. "So," Mike said, looking toward the hallway, "guess you'll be in the guest room." I finally stood up. "I changed the sheets yesterday." Both of them looked at me. Antonio smiled. "Look at that. Cameron's got perfect timing." I shrugged, trying to sound casual. It was already clean. Still, appreciate it. That smile should have been illegal. I escaped upstairs before I embarrassed myself. About an hour later, the power went out. The entire house went dark. For a second, there was complete silence. Then Mike shouted from downstairs, "Seriously?" Antonio started laughing. I couldn't help smiling. A few seconds later, emergency lights clicked on around the house, leaving everything dim instead of completely black. I headed downstairs with my phone flashlight. Mike was standing by the breaker panel, even though we all knew the outage wasn't inside the house. Antonio was by the living room window watching the rain. "It looks worse now," he said quietly. I joined him. The street outside had disappeared behind curtains of rain. Tree branches swayed violently in the wind. "I don't think anybody's driving tonight," I said. He glanced at me. "Looks like I'm your roommate for one night." My stomach immediately betrayed me. I laughed a little too hard. Temporary roommate. Hopefully. We stood there watching the storm in comfortable silence. It wasn't awkward. Actually, it was surprisingly easy. "You've gotten taller," Antonio said after a moment. "Huh? The last time we actually talked for more than 5 minutes, you were, 19? 21 now," He blinked. No way. Way. Damn. He smiled to himself. I guess I've been getting old. I laughed. You've been old. Oh, wow. I couldn't let that one go. He pointed at me. You're funnier than your brother. Don't tell him that. Our secret. Something about the way he said it made me smile. The lights flickered once, then went dark again, completely dark. The backup battery had finally died. Only the flashlights on our phones lit the room now. From the kitchen, Mike called out, I found candles! Antonio leaned closer so I could hear him over another loud crack of thunder. I forgot how crazy storms get around here. So did I. For a second we were standing shoulder to shoulder near the window. Neither of us moved. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't dramatic. It just felt nice. Then Mike interrupted. Cameron? Yeah? Can you help me find more candles? I looked at Antonio. I'll be right back. He nodded. I'll survive. I walked toward the kitchen. I had no idea that before the night was over, one simple accident would leave Antonio with no choice but to stay even longer than anyone expected, and that being stuck under the same roof would make it impossible for either of us to keep pretending nothing was changing. By 10 o'clock, the storm had only gotten worse. The rain hadn't let up for a second, and the wind kept throwing branches against the side of the house, hard enough to make us all look toward the windows every few minutes. Mum called to check on us. Mike put her on speaker. You boys okay? We're fine, Mike answered. Power's out. I figured the weather report says half the county lost electricity. Antonio spoke up. Sorry, I'm invading your house. Mum laughed immediately. Antonio, you've practically lived here since you were 16. Stay as long as you need. After hanging up, Mike looked toward the front door. I should probably check outside. Antonio frowned. In this? The recycling bins are probably halfway down the street. Before either of us could stop him, Mike pulled on a rain jacket and disappeared outside. Antonio shook his head. Your brother never learns. No, I agreed. He really doesn't. We waited near the front window, watching Mike wrestle with 2 trash bins while getting completely soaked. Antonio laughed so hard he nearly dropped the flashlight. He looks ridiculous. He'll deny it later. Absolutely. A loud snap echoed from somewhere nearby, then another. Antonio's smile faded. That didn't sound good. A minute later, Mike came running back toward the porch. The second he stepped inside, water dripped everywhere. Tree branch, he said between breaths. Huge one. Did it hit anything? I asked. Our driveway. Antonio looked through the window. Your truck? Mike sighed. And yours. We all rushed to the front window. A massive oak branch had fallen across the driveway. Neither vehicle looked crushed, but there was no way either one was leaving until somebody came with chainsaws in the morning. Antonio rubbed his forehead. Well, I guess you're definitely staying now, Mike said. Antonio laughed. Looks that way. For some reason, hearing that made me happier than it should have. The rest of the evening settled into something surprisingly comfortable. With no television and no internet, we ended up sitting around the dining room table surrounded by candles. Mike found an old deck of cards. Antonio dealt. You still cheat? Mike asked. I prefer creative strategy. That's cheating. It's only cheating if you catch me. I laughed. Antonio looked over. See? Cameron appreciates good humor. I appreciate watching Mike lose. My own brother. You'll survive. The games went on for nearly 2 hours. I'd forgotten how much fun simple things could be. No phones, no distractions, just conversation. At one point, Mike got a work call and stepped into the hallway where he could barely find enough signal. That left Antonio and me alone at the table. He shuffled the cards absent-mindedly. So? How's life really? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? You always give the polite answer. I looked down at the cards. I don't know. College, okay. Mostly. But, I hesitated, I've been trying to figure out what I actually want to do after graduation. Antonio nodded slowly. I remember that feeling. You do? Oh, yeah. He leaned back in his chair. Everyone assumes adults have everything figured out. You don't? He laughed. Cameron, I'm 24. So? I still call my mom to ask how long chicken stays good in the fridge. I burst out laughing. Seriously? Twice this year. You can't be serious. I wish I wasn't. I laughed harder than I had in weeks. He smiled. There it is. What? I haven't seen you laugh like that before. I suddenly felt self-conscious. I guess I've been stressed. I noticed. You noticed? He shrugged. You've been quieter lately whenever I've come over. That surprised me. I hadn't realized he'd been paying attention. I didn't think anyone could tell. I could? For a moment, neither of us spoke. The candlelight softened everything, making the room feel smaller somehow, warmer. You know, Antonio said quietly, it's okay not to have everything planned. I keep telling myself that. Believe it. I looked at him. He wasn't giving empty advice. He meant it. That was one of the things I liked most about him. Nothing he said ever sounded rehearsed. You've always been good at making people feel better, I admitted. He smiled faintly. I try. Footsteps interrupted us. Mike came back into the room carrying his phone. Bad news. What now? Antonio asked. The road's closed. What? Flooding near the bridge. Antonio let out a slow whistle. So I'm really trapped. Until at least tomorrow afternoon. He leaned back dramatically. I guess I'm officially moving in. You still owe rent? Mike replied. I knew there was a catch. We all laughed. But as I glanced toward Antonio, I couldn't ignore the strange feeling growing in my chest. Less than 4 hours ago, I'd expected this to be another ordinary Saturday. Now the storm had trapped him here, and somehow the house already felt different. I couldn't explain why. I just knew that spending an entire night, and maybe even another day, with Antonio was becoming something I was looking forward to far more than I should have. I woke up to the smell of coffee. For a second I forgot why I was home instead of in my apartment. Then I remembered the storm. The power was still out. Antonio was still here. I pulled on a hoodie and headed downstairs. The kitchen was lit by morning sunlight spilling through the windows, and somehow Antonio had managed to make coffee using one of my dad's old camping percolators. I didn't know anyone actually used that thing, I said. He looked up and smiled. Your dad gave me a quick lesson a couple years ago. Seriously? He said every guy should know how to survive a power outage. I laughed. That sounds exactly like him. Antonio handed me a mug. I can't promise it'll taste amazing. I took a sip. It tastes surprisingly good. He grinned. I'll take that. For a while we stood in the quiet kitchen, listening to the rain tapping against the windows. It wasn't nearly as violent as the night before, but it still wasn't safe to drive. Mike stumbled downstairs a few minutes later, rubbing his eyes. Please tell me that's coffee. Antonio lifted the pot. Fresh. I've never loved you more. You say that every time I feed you. Because it's true. I rolled my eyes while they laughed. Their friendship had always looked effortless. They could joke about anything without ever worrying someone would take it personally. It was something I'd always admired. After breakfast, we walked outside to inspect the damage. The air smelled fresh, the kind it always does after a storm. But the yard looked completely different. Leaves covered the grass. Small branches were scattered everywhere. The giant oak limbs still blocked the driveway. Antonio let out a low whistle. That's even bigger than I remembered. Mike kicked one end of the branch. Yeah, we're not moving this ourselves. My phone buzzed. The county emergency alert said cleanup crews were overwhelmed and might not reach residential streets until the evening. Antonio looked over my shoulder. So you're still trapped? He laughed. I'm beginning to think your house doesn't want me to leave. I think it's just the tree. Let's blame the tree. While Mike called the utility company, Antonio and I started picking up smaller branches around the backyard. It wasn't exciting work, but somehow it was nice. So, Antonio said after tossing another armful into a pile. Your brother told me you're looking for internships. Yeah. Any luck? A few interviews. That's better than none, I guess. He noticed my expression immediately. Not feeling confident? I shrugged. Everyone else seems ahead of me. Antonio rested a rake against the fence. You know what I was doing at 21? What? Delivering furniture. I blinked. I thought you'd always worked for the construction company. Nope. What happened? I had no clue what I wanted. So what changed? He smiled. Someone gave me a chance. Those words stayed with me, maybe because they were exactly what I needed to hear. Around lunchtime, Mike's boss called. The roofing company had several emergency jobs after the storm. I've got to go, Mike said. Antonio stared at him. Go where? They're sending someone with a truck to pick me up. What about the driveway? They'll park on the street. He looked between us. You guys good here? I nodded. Antonio did too. Within 20 minutes, Mike was gone. The house suddenly became quiet. Just me and Antonio. Neither of us seemed to know what to say at first. Finally, he looked toward the living room. Well, I guess we're officially roommates for the day. I laughed. Looks like it. He stretched. Want to help me make lunch? As long as you don't burn anything. He looked offended. Excuse me. I remember your attempt at pancakes. That happened one time. You set off the smoke alarm. They were ambitious pancakes. They were charcoal. They had personality. I couldn't stop laughing. Yet you've been waiting years to use that against me, haven't you? Maybe. We ended up making grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. Simple, nothing fancy. While the soup heated on the gas stove, Antonio leaned against the counter. You know, what? I've always liked talking with you. That caught me off guard. You have? Sure. I always figured you were just being nice. He frowned. No. No? I mean it. He looked genuinely confused. I wouldn't ask about your classes or your artwork if I didn't actually care. Something warm settled in my chest. I didn't know that. You hide more than you realize, Cameron. What do you mean? He hesitated. You're always observing everyone else. But nobody ever knows what's going on in your head. I looked away. I guess that's true. You don't have to do that all the time. His voice was gentle, not pushy, just honest. Before I could answer, the smoke detector suddenly chirped. Antonio looked at the pan. Oh, I started laughing. You burned it. I slightly overcooked one sandwich. It happened again. You are never letting this go. Absolutely not. He laughed too. The tension disappeared instantly. A few minutes later, we carried our lunch to the back porch. The clouds had finally started breaking apart, letting patches of blue sky peek through. This is nice, Antonio said. It is. He looked out across the yard. You know. What? I'm kind of glad the storm happened. I turned toward him. You are? I mean, not the damage. He smiled. I just don't usually get the chance to slow down like this. Neither do I thought. For a moment we simply sat there in comfortable silence. Then I noticed something. Antonio wasn't looking at the yard anymore. He was looking at me. Only for a second. The moment our eyes met, he smiled and looked away. Maybe it didn't mean anything. Maybe I was imagining it. But for the first time since I'd met him, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had changed between us, it wasn't happening only in my head. By late afternoon, the neighborhood had finally started coming back to life. A few utility trucks rolled down the street. Chainsaws buzzed somewhere a couple of houses away. Kids were already outside riding bikes as if the storm had never happened. Our driveway, unfortunately, was still blocked. Antonio stood at the front window with his hands in his pockets. I've officially worn the same clothes for almost 24 hours, I smiled. My brother's got clean t-shirts. Does he? I'll grab one. A few minutes later, Antonio walked back downstairs, wearing one of Mike's old grey shirts. It fit a little tighter across his shoulders than it did on my brother. He looked at the sleeves. I think your brother shrunk this. I think you're just bigger than he is. He laughed. I'll pretend that was a compliment. It was. He looked at me for a second before smiling. I'll take it. Around 5, we decided to walk to the neighborhood convenience store. The roads were finally safe enough, and sitting inside all day was starting to make both of us restless. The air was cool after the storm, carrying that fresh smell of wet grass and pine trees. We walked side by side without really thinking about it. So, Antonio said, what's your plan after graduation? I honestly don't know. You ever think about moving? Sometimes. Anywhere specific? I've always liked Seattle. He nodded. Good city. You've been? A couple of times for work. Lucky. He shrugged. Traveling sounds more exciting than it actually is. I'd still like to see more places. You will? You sound pretty sure. I am. I laughed. You always seem confident. He looked ahead instead of at me. I fake it more than you'd think. That surprised me. You. Everybody does sometimes. I thought about that for a while. Antonio had always seemed like someone who knew exactly where he was headed. Hearing him admit otherwise made him feel, more real somehow. The convenience store was surprisingly busy. People were stocking up on bottled water, batteries, and snacks after the outage. Antonio grabbed a basket. What are we buying? Ice cream. He looked confused. The power just came back. Exactly. We're celebrating? We're celebrating. He laughed. I like your priorities. We wandered through the aisles longer than necessary. Somehow we ended up arguing over which chips were better. Barbecue, I insisted. Wrong. They're objectively better. Sour cream and onion. I can't believe we're having this conversation. You started it. No, I defended the truth. He nudged my shoulder lightly. You always this stubborn? You'll never know. I think I'm finding out. There was something easy about being around him now. The awkwardness I'd expected never really showed up. Instead, it felt like we'd skipped straight to being comfortable. As we reached the checkout, the cashier looked between us. You guys brothers? Before I could answer, Antonio smiled. No. Could have fooled me, she said. You two have the same expressions. I glanced at Antonio. He was already looking at me. We both laughed at the same time. The walk home was quieter, not uncomfortable, just peaceful. The sun was beginning to set, painting the clouds orange and pink after the storm. Antonio broke the silence first. Can I ask you something? Sure. You've never brought anyone home. I blinked. What do you mean? A girlfriend. Oh. I tried to keep my voice steady. I haven't really dated much. He nodded slowly. By choice? Sort of. He didn't push, didn't joke, didn't make it awkward. Instead, he simply said, there's no deadline. I appreciated that more than he probably realized. When we got back to the house, we found Mike's truck pulling into the street. He climbed out looking completely exhausted. Good news, he announced. The county's sending a crew tomorrow morning to clear the tree. Antonio raised an eyebrow. So one more night? Looks like it. Mike looked between us. You guys survive being stuck together all day? Antonio answered first. Barely. I laughed. He's lying. Worst roommate I've ever had. You burned lunch. That was one sandwich. It was 2. He pointed at me dramatically. Traitor. Mike looked back and forth between us with an amused smile. You two got along better than I expected. Neither of us answered because he was right. Somewhere over the last day, something had shifted. The conversations had become easier. The silences had become comfortable. Even simple moments, walking to the store, making lunch, sitting on the porch, had started feeling strangely important. That night, after dinner, Mike announced he was going to bed early. I've got another 6 a.m. shift tomorrow. He disappeared upstairs, leaving Antonio and me alone in the living room. The television still wasn't working properly after the outage, so we ended up sitting on opposite ends of the couch talking, with only a small lamp lighting the room. After a while, Antonio looked at me. You know? What? I'm glad we got stuck. I smiled. I was just thinking the same thing. For a moment, neither of us looked away. There was something different in his expression now, warmer, more thoughtful. Then headlights swept across the front window as another cleanup truck drove past outside. The moment broke, but it didn't disappear. It lingered quietly between us, making me wonder if the storm wasn't the only thing that had changed over the last 2 days. I couldn't sleep. It wasn't because the guest room was occupied or because the storm had left the house strangely quiet. It was because my brain wouldn't stop replaying every conversation I'd had with Antonio over the last 2 days. The way he'd actually listened, the way he'd remembered little things about me, the way being around him somehow felt effortless. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like an hour before giving up. Maybe a glass of water would help. I quietly walked downstairs. The kitchen light was already on. Antonio looked up from the table, a mug of tea in his hands. He smiled. "So, I'm not the only one. You couldn't sleep either?" He shook his head. "Too much coffee this morning." I laughed. "Your fault." "I know." I grabbed a glass of water and sat across from him. For a minute, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It felt, familiar. "I'll probably miss this place," Antonio admitted. I looked at him. "Really? Your family?" He smiled to himself. "They've always made me feel welcome. My mom definitely treats you like another son." "I know." He chuckled softly. "She still texts me on my birthday, before Mike remembers." "That sounds about right." We both laughed. Then his expression softened. "I didn't really have this growing up." "What do you mean?" "My parents divorced when I was 13. "I didn't know that." "Not many people do." He traced a finger around the rim of his mug. "Dad moved across the country. Mom worked all the time." "So, Mike's family kind of became yours?" He nodded. "Your parents invited me over for holidays when they realized I'd be alone." I felt a lump form in my throat. My mom never told me. "She probably didn't think it mattered. It mattered to you." He smiled. "Yeah." For the first time, I realized why Antonio always seemed so comfortable here. It wasn't just because he and Mike were best friends. This house had become home to him in ways I'd never understood. "I'm glad they did that," I said quietly. He looked at me. "So am I." The next morning, sunlight filled the kitchen. The cleanup crew had finally arrived. Outside, chainsaws echoed through the neighborhood as workers began cutting apart the giant oak branch. Mike looked relieved. "Looks like you'll finally get your truck back." Antonio nodded. "I guess so." His voice sounded almost disappointed. I wasn't sure if I imagined it. By lunchtime, the driveway was clear. The workers waved before pulling away. Everything was finally back to normal, or at least it should have been. Antonio carried his overnight bag to the front door. "Well," Mike clapped him on the shoulder, "thanks for surviving the weekend." "Barely. You still owe me for eating half the cereal." "I regret nothing." They laughed. Then Antonio turned toward me. "Thanks for keeping me company." "Thanks for—" "No problem. I mean it. I know." For a second it felt like he wanted to say something else. Instead, he smiled. "I'll see you around." "Yeah." He walked toward his truck. Something inside me sank. It was ridiculous. He lived 20 minutes away. He'd almost certainly be back at our house sometime next week. Yeah, but after spending 2 days talking with him, laughing with him, getting to know him outside of being my brother's friend, watching him leave felt different. I stood on the porch until his truck disappeared around the corner. Life settled back into its normal routine, classes, assignments, work, but something had changed. Antonio started texting me. At first it was simple, Antonio. "Found those barbecue chips. Still think they're overrated." I replied with a picture of the same chips sitting in my grocery cart. "Cameron, you're just afraid of being wrong." A few minutes later, "Antonio, impossible." The conversations kept growing. A funny picture, a movie recommendation. Questions about school. He'd ask how an interview went, I'd ask how work was. Some nights, we'd exchange messages for 20 minutes. Other nights, 2 hours would disappear before either of us noticed. One Friday evening, my phone buzzed while I was finishing a design project. Antonio. Quick question. Cameron. Depends. Antonio. Want to grab coffee tomorrow? I stared at the screen. Just the two of us? My heart immediately started racing. Before I could overthink it, another message appeared. Antonio. Mike has to work, and I'm tired of drinking coffee alone. I smiled, despite myself. After a long moment, I typed my reply. Cameron, yeah, I'd like that. A few seconds later, 3 dots appeared, then one final message. Antonio. Good. I was hoping you'd say yes. I looked at my phone for a long time after that. I still didn't know exactly what was happening between us. Maybe it was just a friendship. Maybe I was reading too much into everything. But one thing had become impossible to deny. The storm that trapped Antonio at our house hadn't just changed one weekend. It had started something neither of us seemed ready to walk away from. I spent an embarrassing amount of time deciding what to wear for coffee, not because it was a date. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. It was just, coffee. Friends grabbed coffee all the time, so why had I changed shirts 3 times? Cameron, I heard my mum calling from downstairs. He's here! My heart immediately sped up. I walked outside, trying to look casual. Antonio was leaning against his truck with 2 coffees already in his hands. You bought mine? I asked. He shrugged. I guessed your order. You guessed? He handed me the cup. I took 1 sip. How did you know? He smiled. You've ordered the same thing every time I've seen you at that cafe. I stared at him. You remembered that? You'd be surprised what I remember. For some reason, that sentence stayed with me for the rest of the day. Instead of going inside the cafe, we took our drinks to a small park overlooking the river. It was quiet. A few people walked dogs along the trail, but otherwise it was peaceful. I come here sometimes after work, Antonio said. I've never been. You seem like you'd like it. He was right. We found an empty bench beneath a huge maple tree. For a while we talked about everything and nothing. Movies, music, travel, favorite restaurants. It felt strangely natural. So, Antonio said, how'd the interview go? I got called back. His face lit up. Seriously? I nodded. They want a second interview next week. That's awesome. I was honestly shocked. You shouldn't be. I laughed. You've never even seen my portfolio. I've seen enough? What does that mean? He looked at me with complete confidence. It means you're talented, Cameron. The compliment hit harder than I expected, not because nobody had ever said it before, because I believed him. We stayed at the park for almost 3 hours. Neither of us noticed how late it had gotten until Antonio checked his phone. Wow. What? I was supposed to meet Mike half an hour ago. I laughed. I guess we lost track of time. I guess we did. As we walked back toward his truck, he slowed down. You know. What? I'm glad we started talking more. I smiled. Me too. I always wanted to. I frowned. You did? Sure. You could have. He rubbed the back of his neck. I always figured you weren't that interested. I stopped walking. You thought that? You were usually pretty quiet around me. I laughed softly. I was quiet because I liked talking to you. The words slipped out before I could stop them. I immediately felt heat rush into my face. Antonio blinked. Oh. I looked down at the sidewalk. I always thought you were easy to talk to. He didn't laugh. He didn't tease me. Instead, he smiled. I'm glad. Over the next few weeks, meeting for coffee became a habit. Sometimes we'd walk through town afterward. Sometimes we'd sit in his truck, listening to music while talking about life. Sometimes he'd stop by campus after work just to see how my day had gone. One evening, after we'd grabbed burgers, we ended up back at my parents' house. Mike wasn't home yet. Mom greeted Antonio with a hug. There you are. I've been told I still owe you a casserole dish. You do. I'll bring it next time. She smiled before disappearing into the kitchen. Antonio looked at me. I still can't believe she remembers things like that. She remembers everything. Apparently. We wandered out to the back porch while dinner finished cooking. The sun was setting behind the trees, filling the yard with warm orange light. Antonio leaned against the railing. I've been meaning to ask you something. Okay. Would you ever want to move out of state? I thought about it. Maybe. Even if it meant leaving everyone behind? It would be hard. He nodded slowly. I've been offered a promotion. That caught me off guard. Really? It would mean moving. Where? Colorado. I stared at him. When? They want an answer by the end of the month. Everything inside me seemed to stop. I'd only just gotten used to having him in my life like this. The thought of him moving halfway across the country made my chest feel unexpectedly heavy. You'd be great at it, I managed. He smiled faintly. Maybe. But he looked out across the yard. I don't know if it's what I want anymore. Before I could ask what he meant, Mike's truck pulled into the driveway. The moment disappeared. But later that night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about his answer. He hadn't sounded excited about the promotion. He'd sounded conflicted. And for the first time, a dangerous thought crossed my mind. What if the reason he was hesitating had something to do with staying here? I quickly pushed the idea away. I didn't want to assume, but I also couldn't ignore the feeling that whatever had begun the night he got stranded at our house had quietly grown into something much bigger than either of us had expected. For the next week, I couldn't stop thinking about Colorado. Not because I wanted to move there, because Antonio might. Every time my phone buzzed, part of me wondered if it was going to be a message saying he'd accepted the promotion. Instead, he kept texting me, like always, memes, coffee recommendations, pictures of dogs he saw at work. It all felt normal, too normal, which somehow made me even more nervous. A few days later, Antonio asked if I wanted to help him wash his truck. You know, that's just an excuse to hang out, right? I replied. He grinned. I was wondering how long it'd take you to figure that out. Saturday afternoon was warm, the kind of day where nobody wanted to be inside. His truck was parked in my parents' driveway. Music played quietly from a portable speaker while we worked. You missed a spot, I said. Antonio splashed water in my direction. I absolutely did not. A few drops landed on my shirt. I stared at him. Really? He smiled. What? I picked up the hose. Oh, no. You started it. Cameron? He never finished the sentence. A stream of water hit him square in the chest. He laughed so hard he nearly dropped the sponge. Oh, that's how we're playing. A second later, he grabbed the bucket. I barely had time to react before cold water splashed over me. You jerk. You deserved it. I absolutely did not. For the next 5 minutes, we completely forgot about washing the truck. We chased each other around the driveway like a couple of kids. By the time we finally stopped, both of us were soaked and laughing too hard to stand up straight. My mom opened the front door. You boys done destroying the driveway? Antonio rubbed the back of his neck. Maybe. She smiled. I'll bring towels. As she disappeared back inside, Antonio looked at me. I haven't laughed like that in a long time. Me neither. The smile slowly faded from his face. Cameron? His tone was different, more serious. I need to tell you something. My stomach tightened. What is it? He took a slow breath. I turned down the promotion. I blinked. You did? He nodded. Yesterday. What happened? They offered more money. And? I still said no. I searched his face. I thought you wanted it. I did. So, why stay? He looked away for a moment before answering, because somewhere over the last few weeks, my priorities changed. My heart started pounding. What do you mean? He was quiet for several seconds. long enough that I wondered if he'd changed his mind. Finally, he looked back at me. When I got stuck here because of that storm. He smiled faintly. I thought it was just bad luck. I listened without saying a word. Then we started talking. He laughed softly. Actually talking. I know. I looked forward to your messages. So did I. I started making excuses to come over. I couldn't help smiling. I noticed. You did? You suddenly needed coffee every weekend. He laughed. Fair. The silence that followed felt heavier than any we'd shared before. Cameron. Yeah? I don't think I stayed because of the job. I felt like my heart had moved into my throat. I think... He stopped himself, then tried again. I think I stayed because I wanted to find out if what I was feeling was real. Neither of us moved. The world suddenly felt incredibly quiet. What are you feeling? I asked softly. His eyes met mine. You. Everything else disappeared. The driveway, the music, the afternoon breeze. It all faded into the background. I know this is complicated, he continued. You're Mike's little brother. I kept telling myself this was a terrible idea. I let out a small laugh. I've been telling myself that for months. His eyebrows lifted. Months? I nodded. I've liked you for a long time. He stared at me in complete disbelief. You never said anything. I didn't think I had a chance. He smiled, almost shaking his head. And I thought you weren't interested. We both laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the misunderstanding suddenly seemed impossible. So, he said quietly. So, where does that leave us? I looked toward the house, then back at him. I think, I smiled. I'd like to find out. His smile was brighter than I'd ever seen. He didn't rush toward me. He didn't try to force the moment. Instead, he stepped a little closer. Can I hold your hand? The question made my chest tighten. You really asked? I figured I should. I laughed. Yes. Our fingers met for the first time, simple, warm, comfortable, and somehow it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Just then the front door opened again. Mum stepped outside, carrying 2 towels. She stopped for half a second, taking in the scene. Then she smiled. I was wondering how long it would take. Antonio and I looked at each other. You, knew? I asked. She laughed. I've raised 3 boys. Antonio rubbed the back of his neck, embarrassed. Was it that obvious? Only to someone paying attention. She handed us the towels. I'm happy for both of you. Then, with perfect timing, she walked back inside and closed the door behind her. Antonio looked at me. I think your mum just saved us from the most awkward conversation of my life. I laughed. Probably. He squeezed my hand gently. So? You want to go on an actual date? I smiled. I thought you'd never ask. He laughed. I've only been working up the courage for about a month. And here I thought I was the nervous one. You definitely weren't the only one. As we walked toward the backyard together, I couldn't help thinking back to the storm that had stranded Antonio at our house. At the time, it had felt like terrible luck. Now it felt like the best unexpected thing that had ever happened to either of us. I don't think either of us stopped smiling for the next 10 minutes. It wasn't because we'd suddenly become a couple. It was because the guessing was finally over. No more wondering, no more reading too much into every glance or every text message. We'd finally said it out loud. Antonio looked at me and laughed. I cannot believe your mom figured it out before we did. I grinned. She probably knew before I did. That's honestly terrifying. It really is. We stood there for another moment before he cleared his throat. So? I think we still have one very important conversation left. I already knew who he meant. Mike. He nodded. I don't want him hearing it from someone else. Neither do I. That evening, Mike finally got home after another long shift. He walked into the kitchen, dropped his keys on the counter, and immediately opened the refrigerator. I'm starving. Mom looked at Antonio and then at me. You boys want to tell him? Antonio glanced at me. You want to? I took a deep breath. Yeah. Mike? He looked up. What? I need to tell you something. He raised an eyebrow. Okay. Antonio stepped beside me. The room suddenly felt very quiet. We've been spending a lot of time together, I began. I noticed. And I looked at Antonio. He gave me a reassuring nod. We decided we'd like to see where this goes. Mike stared at both of us. For several seconds, he didn't say a word. My stomach twisted into knots. Finally, he sighed dramatically. I knew it. Antonio blinked. You knew. Mike pointed between us. You two disappeared for coffee every weekend? Neither of us answered. You texted each other constantly. Antonio scratched the back of his neck. Maybe. And, Mike continued, I've never seen Cameron voluntarily wash someone else's truck. I laughed despite myself. That's fair. He shook his head. He shook his, I've been waiting for one of you to admit it. Antonio looked genuinely confused. You weren't, mad? Mike frowned. Why would I be? Because I'm your friend. And he's my brother. Exactly. He leaned against the counter. I care about both of you. He looked at me first. You happy? I nodded. Yeah. Then he looked at Antonio. You planning on treating him right? Antonio answered without hesitation. Absolutely. Mike smiled. Then I've got no problem. The tension I'd been carrying for weeks disappeared in an instant. Antonio let out a long breath. I've been nervous about that conversation for days. I know. Mike laughed. You guys seriously overthink everything. Probably. Definitely. Our first official date happened the following Friday. Antonio insisted on planning everything. I'm picking you up at 6. You won't tell me where we're going? Nope. You know, I hate surprises. I know. That's evil. I've accepted that. At exactly 6, he pulled into the driveway. This time, instead of his work clothes, he was wearing a navy button-up shirt I'd never seen before. You clean up pretty well, I said as I got into the truck. Gida, he smiled. I was about to say the same thing. Dinner was at a small Italian restaurant about 30 minutes away. Nothing fancy, just quiet enough that we could actually talk. Halfway through the meal, I looked across the table at him. What? You seem happy. I am. He smiled, and so do you. I am. Neither of us needed to say anything else. After dinner, we walked along the river, where we'd had coffee weeks earlier. The sun had already gone down, and lights reflected across the water. Antonio stopped near the same bench where we'd first talked about our futures. Funny. What? This is where I realized I was in trouble? I laughed. What did I do? You smiled. That's all? You smiled at me like I mattered. His voice was quiet. I hadn't had someone do that in a long time. I reached for his hand. I'm glad you got stuck at our house. He intertwined his fingers with mine. So am I. The months that followed felt surprisingly normal. Not perfect, just real. We learned each other's habits. Antonio discovered I stole fries off his plate every single time we ate together. I learned he sang along to every song on the radio, even when he didn't know the words. He came to my graduation. I helped him repaint his living room after he finally bought his first house. Mom still invited him to every family dinner. The only difference now was that nobody teased us for sitting next to each other anymore. It was simply expected. One evening, nearly a year after the storm, we were sitting on my parents' back porch watching another summer rain roll in. The thunder sounded almost identical to the night. Everything began. Antonio smiled toward the sky. You hear that? The storm? Yeah, I laughed. I'll never complain about thunderstorms again. He looked at me. Neither will I. Because one stranded you here? He shook his head. No. He squeezed my hand. Because one brought me to the person I was supposed to meet in a completely different way. I smiled. You know, what? If that tree hadn't fallen, I would have driven home. We probably would have stayed exactly the way we were. He nodded. I've thought about that too. The rain grew heavier. Neither of us moved. For the first time in my life, a thunderstorm didn't feel loud or inconvenient. It felt like the beginning of something. Sometimes people spend years waiting for the perfect moment to change their lives. For us, it wasn't a grand gesture or some dramatic confession. It was a blocked driveway, a powerless house, too much coffee, long conversations, and one unexpected weekend that turned two familiar faces into something neither of us had seen coming. Looking back now, I don't remember the inconvenience of being stuck inside. I remember the laughter, the quiet talks in the kitchen, the walk to the convenience store, the first cup of coffee, the first time we held hands. And every time I hear thunder in the distance, I still smile. Because some storms don't ruin your plans. Sometimes they become the reason everything works out exactly the way it was meant to.